So what's going on, everybody? Thanks again for joining me. I'm starting this weird series where I kind of just do random tutorials on things that I like. And so this time I'm actually doing a tutorial on Node.js, and not just Node.js, but how to build a scalable Node.js application. And one big issue that I see is that a lot of people tend to build a server or any type of code and don't really think about a team-based environment where other people will be working in code. And so, if we apply the same principles of building modular and smaller, like tiny components, to server side or any other code that you write, then a lot of other people can have hands-on in the code without having to worry about things like conflicts and maybe editing some code that you're working on or working on the same file as you. You don't have to sit there sweating whenever you push your code up, hoping that they're not messing with it. In some cases, you can avoid it, but in the cases where you can, it'd be best to try to do so. And so that's what we're going to be working on today. So we're going to be building a very basic Node server with a database using SQLite 3, and I'm going to explain as much as I can. Just know that this is not a beginner's course. We're not going to be going over every single thing, but I am going to explain as much as I possibly can. So with that said, we're going to start off by going into our git bash or terminal of your choice or whatever, and we're going to create a new directory. And so we're going to have make directory, and we can just say server demo or something like that. And then here's a cool little trick that if you want to actually make the directory and then cd into it, then you can just add the double ampersand and then just do a cd server demo, and it'll execute both at the same time. So there it is, and as you can see, we're in the cd demo. So right now everything is empty. The first thing I want to do is initialize a new yarn project. This will give us a package.json, so we can do yarn init, and you can do the same thing with npm. I think for npm is like npm init -y or something like that. I don't know. So we're gonna give it a name of just demo server. You're not gonna see it on mine just because my thing is crazy. Let's see, invalid package name, so whatever, that's fine. And then we're just going to hit enter. You can write descriptions and fill this stuff out if you want. We want to keep the index.js as the main entry point. You can switch that if you decide to switch your main entry point's name, but I'm just going to leave it like that. And I'm not going to add the URL for GitHub. For our author, you can put your name if you want, or you can put mine. I don't care, that'll be weird, but whatever. And then private, we can set that to false. And so now if we check, we have our package.json, we're cd'd into it. So what I want to do now actually is just add a few packages in there, and I'll try to explain them as best as I can while we're doing it. But if you don't know too much about them, then I would say to just go into the documentation for these. You can usually just type npm and then just the name of the packages, and it'll come up. So we're going to do a yarn add. If you're using npm, then it's yarn install, and we're going to be adding bcrypt.js. Make sure you're using bcrypt.js, not regular bcrypt. There are two different modules that do very similar things, but some of the functions that or built-in methods that I'm going to be using might not work with regular bcrypt. And so what bcrypt.js does is helps encrypts your passwords and all that and hashes them. You can use salt and all that fun stuff, but we're going to use very basic functionality for them, and we're not even going to be building registration or anything like that. So it's completely fine if you don't want to use it, but I'll show you later why I'm using it. And then we're also going to be adding Express, which Express is just a framework for Node, which helps you, it basically helps you deal with Node a lot easier than the normal Node environment. So, and then we're going to be adding Faker, which Faker lets you add a lot of fake data without having to hard code all of it. So instead of having to write a user's name and email and password or whatever else you have, then you can just use Faker. Works with like company names, cell phone numbers, emails. So it's all just fake data that it puts up there for you. We're going to be adding Helmet, and Helmet is a basically a security for your header. So normally without Helmet, once you send a resolve for a HTTP request, it'll basically send in just about everything. It'll send in the technology you're using. It'll tell them that you're using Express. It'll send a lot of unneeded data that they don't need to know about, and so that sets you up for attackers because now they know how to approach your server to try to get things that they want. And so Helmet will cover a lot of that up for you. And then we're going to be adding Next, which helps us deal with the database. And so we'll be doing quite a few things with that. So it'll be a lot easier to show you than it will be to explain. But Next is a pretty big package. So we're going to be adding Morgan, which is pretty much a logger. It tells you things like the status of your HTTP request, depending on how you configure it. I don't really do a lot of configuring with it. So we're going to keep it very basic here. We're going to be using SQLite 3, which is going to be our database. You can install Postgres if you want to switch us over to Postgres on deployment for production, but just for development purposes, we're going to keep it with SQLite 3 since it's pretty fast. And then we're going to be adding UUID, which helps you generate unique IDs. To me, it's better than the built-in IDs that you would get from Connects.js. Just because it's a lot more difficult for somebody to guess a user's ID through using this. Okay, so and then we're gonna hit enter and it's gonna install all of those packages. We still have one more package that we need to install, and so that's gonna be NodeMon, which NodeMon, if you haven't used it before, we're gonna install it as a dependency. So we're gonna say yarn add and then say NodeMon and then -d. So -d helps install it as a dependency rather than a regular or it's going to install it as a dev dependency rather than a regular dependency, which basically means that our application doesn't really need it in order to run. It's only going to need it for development purposes. So what NodeMon does is it actually keeps an eye on your server so that if you make any changes and save them, NodeMon will refresh the server and take those changes into consideration. If you don't have that, then you're going to have to stop and restart your server every single time that you save a new change that you want to check out. Okay, so we're going to open this, and I have VS Code, so I can just type in code and then period. If you don't have VS Code, then it's going to be different method or something. It's completely fine if you use another type of service instead of this. Just know that if you don't have VS Code, then you're basically going to just have to open it manually or through some other command line. Okay, so first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create our index.js. And so index.js is going to be the first location that we're going to put our server. And so the first thing that I want to do in our index.js, and I just want to build a very quick server just to start it. And so we're going to do that by defining Express. So Express, which is going to be our server. And so we're going to bring in Express, and then we're going to pretty much create our server. Now you could use app. Some people would build it like this, but I just use server just because to me it makes more sense than just saying app, because it's not an app. But a lot of the examples that you'll see are going to have the server. So this is going to be equal to the new Express instance, and also want to make our actual port. So there's a reason why we just type it in here and don't just type it in later on in the actual method that starts the server. We can add our environment variable here. So if you haven't deployed before, basically what this process.env does is once you deploy your application, it no longer has access to this localhost port 9000 or 3000 or 4000, whatever you prefer. This is pretty much just us telling it that this is where we want it to run. But if you put this up on, say, Heroku or some other hosting site like that, they won't have access to localhost. And so what they do have access is this port environmental variable that's predefined, and they're pretty much going to issue it. So this variable basically helps us have that preset so we don't have to worry about it later. All right, so now to actually start the server, we can write server or app, whatever you decided to use, and then we're going to be using the method for listen, and we can pass in our port and then an anonymous function, which just returns a console log. And so you can type in whatever you want over here. I'm going to be typing in server is running on port, and then I created a template literal, which is what these cool little backticks are. It lets us put in that port that we just passed in through here. It lets us put it in there. And so now we have our server. So before I start my actual server, one thing that I want to do over here is actually add in some scripts. And if you don't know what scripts are basically just a short way of being able to type in something without having to do too much. So easier way to do it is just to show you. We're gonna create our first one, which is start, and you don't really need to do this, but just for the purposes of showing off a few scripts, very basic one would be one. Actually, before I even do this, we have to use the scripts keyword. All right, which will put it into an object. And so we can drop this back in there. So it's going to call in node, and then it's going to call it on index.js. So that'll immediately start our server, but it won't watch it. It'll basically start at one time, and every time that we need to take in a change into consideration, we'll have to keep stopping and starting it over. So that's when we add this separate one, which is server, and you can pick whatever name you want. You can pick start. Some people will choose like dev or crayon. It doesn't really matter. If you like saying yarn crayon, then go for it. But I'm just going to be going with conventional methods by using server. And so we can just say nodemon, and nodemon will automatically track it and basically keep it running. So we save that, and then we can do a yarn, let's say server, see if it runs, and there we go, API 9000. So if I make any changes to this, it'll basically keep tracking that. Okay. So the next thing that I want to look at, however, is our index.js. So I don't want to keep the server in here just because once I do that, a lot of things are going to be required to be defined by the server. So I would have to import all of my basically import all of my middleware and everything in here, and this file is going to get packed with a bunch of stuff. And so that goes against building in components or building modular code that other people can interact with. And so what I want to do instead is actually extract this out of here. We don't need that in here. And I want to actually make a few files. So in this case, I'm going to make two files. We're going to make directory, and the first file we're going to make is the API. Second file we're going to make is going to be the data file. So the API is going to have all of our server stuff, it's going to have our routes, it's going to have helpers, middlewares, all of that. The data file is going to have our actual database. It's going to have our migrations that we're going to build with next or connects. It's going to have our seeds. So basically everything that has to do with that. So essentially what we have here is going to be the basic file structure here, and it's not going to get any bigger because everything else is going to be nested in there. So within API, I want to create one file. So let's just cd into API, and I want to create one file called server.js. That's going to be our actual server. So all of that server stuff that we had up here, we're going to push up there, and I'll explain why in a second. And we're going to make three files. So make directory config, and config is basically going to have all of our middleware, and then helpers is going to have all of the helper functions that we're going to use to interact with the database, and then routes. All right, so now we have that over here, and if we go into our server.js, like I said before, I'm going to want to put in a lot of that logic in there to include a lot of stuff that has to do with the actual server and the middleware. So first thing that we need to do is define our server. So we're going to bring in express and then say require express and then const server. Again, you can use app if you want. I like to use server just because I feel like it makes the most sense. And so then from there we can use our basic server.use command, and we can pretty much use our basic built-in express method, which is going to be express.json, which is pretty much going to it's going to give us access to the JSON command so that we can send out JSON responses to the front end. And then we will build our first basic route. And all this is going to do is it's pretty much a sanity test. It's going to let us know that our API works, our server works. It's not going to really return any data. It's just going to return a message. So the first things that we need to do is call server.get, which is just going to be a get route, and then from there, or a get request, and then from there we're going to pass in our root route. And so the next thing that it's going to take is a parameter. So the first thing we're going to have is request, which you might often see as rec, and then response. And if you look up here, it tells you that this is the request handler and all that. So this is going to be request and response. Those are the two that it takes. And so request is basically what is sent in from the front end. A lot of times it'll come back as rec.body or request.body, and that's basically going to be like inputs from the front end. So if you have a form of some kind, maybe an input that takes a username, password, and all that, it's going to come in through the rec. Res is basically everything that you're sending back to the user, or back to the front end. And so it's going to be response to the front end's actions. Okay. So with that said, we're going to finish building this very basic sanity test. And so res gives us access to a few things. So it gives us access to a built-in method called status, and status is basically the HTTP code that we're sending back. So we're sending back status 200, which is just okay. It's just a general nothing went wrong, everything went okay, nothing broke. And then we're going to be using .send, which is going to send a nice little object to the front end saying that the server is alive. So very simple. Okay, so now if I were to let's say run this method, well, let me run the server first. If I can find my git bash, I can never find this thing. So if you press the up key, it'll give you the last command that you did. Just keep pressing that up until you hit yarn server, and then just go ahead and run that. Which we haven't actually exported this yet, so of course it's going to give us a error. So in order to do that, what we want to export is server. So we defined it up here as we defined it. We attached a few things to it. We attached the use method over here for the express.json. We attached the get over here, the get request. And so now we need to export that server. So we're going to say module.exports equals server. So basically, like I said, we defined our server here, and then passed it a few middleware methods or whatever, and then passed it the get request, and now we're exporting this server that has all of these things in it. So we're exporting that, and then we need to go into our index now, and basically tell our server where that server is coming from. So we're gonna say const server equals require, and then we want to go into that API file. So API and then server. So now this server down here knows where that server is coming from, and so our nodemon, if you see over here, it's happy. I'm gonna run it again just so that you can see it. But our nodemon is now happy. So with that said, we can basically get this from over here. We just have to open up our Postman. If you've never used Postman before, um, it's a very simple testing tool that lets you test all of your API routes. I might even have some stuff already predefined in here. So yeah, so just from testing a few other things, I already have it in here. So we're gonna test HTTP colon / localhost colon 9000, and we're gonna test that route. So we should get here it is, the message server is alive. So that's what we get from that. That's basically just telling us that our server is good to go, and we can continue working on. So the first thing that I want to actually do is open up our config file and just create a new file called middleware.js. So if you don't know what middleware is, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but middleware is basically the packages. It can either be the packages that you download from npm that do things in between your stuff, or it can be custom middleware, such as something that gives authorization to a particular route based on if a user's role matches that route. So it can be cool stuff like that. I'm not going to be going into building custom middleware in this one. I might do it in the next one. I'm not sure yet, but we're going to basically, with our middleware, we're going to basically want to define some of the packages that we installed. So if you remember earlier, I talked about Helmet and how it gives us security for the front end. So we got Helmet, well, security for a header, and you can call that logger or whatever. I've seen some people do that. Well, not with Helmet, but with Morgan. Some people have called it logger just because it logs things. I just like to call it by the name. So Morgan, and then we're gonna do a module.exports. So difference with this module.exports and then this one here is that this one's being treated like just an object. This one here is going to be treated like a function. So basically we're going to pass it server, and as of right now, server is not going to be defined here. It's going to be defined in here. And you could have way more middleware than this, which, like, as of right now with just these two over here, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you have like a whole bunch to include like your custom middlewares and things like that, then this would be a perfect place where you can build and import a bunch of it if you wanted to. So from here, we're going to pass in server.use helmet, server.use Morgan. And I personally, like, if you see over here, it comes up with a bunch of things that you can add in there. You can use combined, common, dev, short, tiny. I personally like to use dev just because it makes me feel good. But you can go with something completely different if you want to just test them out. All Morgan really does is just gives you kind of like a status of your HTTP calls. I think Tiny will actually give you the most details, which doesn't make sense at all to me. But that's how they built it, and it gives you some of them will give you like header details and stuff like that. Okay, so with that said, we have defined our middleware config, and so what I want to do now is go into our server file, and I want to bring that in. So we can say const middleware. And notice we didn't call anything middleware. We're actually defining that now. So over here, even though the file name is middleware, that doesn't matter. We're exporting a anonymous function. So it doesn't have a name, so we have to give it a name before we're allowed to use it. So require, and then we can say config middleware. Okay. So now we're going to call this anonymous function that we gave a name to, and we're going to pass in server. So now we're basically defining this server right over here, and it's taking in all of that stuff that we just exported from this file. So that's our entire middleware there. So like I said, if you installed a whole bunch of middleware to include custom middleware and just shoved it in here, it's just going to pop in right here. And so it's not taking in a lot of space. You still have this page available in case somebody wants to mess with it or create extra files and then import it on here. And basically you'll build a lot more modular. People will still be able to mess with those files and do code on them without interfering with anything you might be doing in here. Okay, so that got us started off. So I think that that's pretty good right there. Now, what we want to do is build out some helpers. So we're going to create 2 files in our helper folder. So let me just, there we go. All right, so we're going to kill this over here. And I'm currently in our API, so I'm going to want to cd into helpers. And the first one that I'm going to make is going to be, we're going to do touch, and then index.js, and then user helper.js. So now we have 2 files in there. So our index is going to be where everything gets imported to and then exported out from. So I know that's going to sound weird, but essentially what you're going to do is, as of right now, we only have this one user helper file because we're only building a small database with one person in there. But what if you had a database with a lot of different relations and a lot of tables, and so you needed helpers for each one of those, and you have this ginormous list of helpers? Because you don't want to consolidate them all into one big file. It can get pretty huge and then make it really hard for a team to work on it. You'll only be able to have like 1 or 2 people working in there at a time if you want to avoid merge conflicts. So we end up splitting them off instead. Okay, so for our helper, we're going to be eventually creating a user model. There's a few things that are going to come from that user. Actually, let's build out the database first, just so that we know what a user will look like. So let's take a backward approach to that. Okay, so with that said, let me just open my integrated terminal, and you can still do this on your regular git bash terminal if you want. I just like to use the terminal over here just because I don't like having to keep find my actual terminal button down there. But you're gonna have to make sure that you have connects installed globally. You can go into the documentation to figure out how to do that. But I already have it installed globally, and so I'm going to just do a few next commands. So the first thing I'm going to do is next init. So next init gives us this cool little next config file over here, and what it does is it basically tells us, for right now, the only thing we care about is development and migration, and we're going to also add one for seeding. But for development, it tells us what we're going to be using. We're going to be using SQLite 3. It's going to tell us where it's going to create the database. We're going to basically add it into another file. Don't really care too much about staging and pooling and all that stuff. That's more Postgres stuff that we're not going to be touching here. But we're going to be adding some migrations up here and some seeding stuff. So first thing that we're going to have to do is migrations. We're going to create a table name, and that's going to be next underscore migrations. And then we're going to tell it what directory that we want it to go to. So this is going to be inside of database, or our data file, and then migrations. So it's going, whenever we create that initial migration, it's going to create it inside of this folder right here. Next thing we're going to need is we're going to be creating some seeds. And seeds are just basically the fake data, like fake users and all that to populate your website with, or fake organizations, companies, things like that. So we're going to do the same thing with our data, and we're going to be putting that in a folder called seeds. And then the last thing we need over here is use null as default, and that's more so of a Postgres thing that lets you basically, if you don't fill out any of this or whatever, it's going to by default just use null. So not a big deal. The rest of all this stuff, you can delete it if you want to. We're not going to be using it. You can look into it later on if you want to, but essentially it already has stuff set up for you in case you do want to set up a Postgres database. You would just fill out all of this with it, and it would basically go off of that. Okay, so now we can, we've already got everything set up over here. One last thing before I forget, I need to actually switch this so that it goes into our data file. Okay, so now we can do next migrate, and then we can say make. If I remember correctly, I think that's what the command was. So make, let's call it users. All right, so if we go into our data folder over here, it created a folder called migrations, and then it has this really ugly random number over here. And basically what it did was it created a table for us. So we did that short little command. It created a simple little migration for us, and now we just have to fill it up and basically define what a user is. So we're going to pretty much create, we're going to return a next object, which is going to be our table. So it's going to be next.schema.create table. And then that table is going to take it's going to take two things. It's going to take our user, which is just the name of the table, so users, and that can be whatever name you want, but for the purpose of the fact that we're building a user or a set of users, then I'm just going to call it users. And then a parameter, and this can be anything. That can be like, you know, alphabet soup or whatever you want, A, B, C, D or whatever, but it's just a parameter that's saying, you know, at the very beginning of everything, this is what we're going to call it. So we're creating tables, and so the first thing that we want to do is pass in a string as an ID. So normally you wouldn't do this if you're just if you don't really care about the ID and you just need quick data or whatever. You don't really need to do this. You can just have SQL or Next create a connects, create a unique ID, and it'll do it for you. But just for the purposes of this, we're going to be using UUID, so we need to create it as a string, and then we're going to define it ourselves. So not nullable basically means that it can't be null, it can't be empty. We have to provide something, so it's kind of like a stopgap, letting us know that we need to pass something in. So the next thing we're going to be passing in is going to be first name, and that's a string, and it's going to be 128 characters max, and then that's going to be not nullable. Next thing is going to be table.string. Going to be doing the same thing for the last name. If I could write it down right. So last name, same thing, is going to be 128 characters, not nullable. And then we're going to also create a role. So all of these are going to be strings. So role, if you want to add like a number or something like that, you know, feel free to do so. Alright, so there we go. And then table.string, and then we're going to take an email, and then that's also going to be 128, and we won't really care too much about email and password. Okay, so there we go. Now we also need to, down over here where it says exports.down, The whole purpose of this function down here is going to be in case we need to roll our database back. So with your migrations, you have migrations or migrates or whatever you want to call it, and then you have rollback. So rollback is if, like, let's say I made a mistake with a user, I needed to come back over here and change some things, I want to roll it back. And that's what this function is going to take care of. So we're going to return connects.schema.drop table if exists. So if the table exists, it's going to drop it, and it's going to look for the one called users in this case. Okay, so now we're done with that. So now we can also start thinking about our seeds as well, and a few other things that I want to think about. But before I do all of that, I want to create a config file. And a config file, all it does is just helps us determine what environment we're in. So simplifying a lot of stuff, and does a lot of the thinking for us in case you do want to deploy later on. So let's just in the database folder, just create a db config.js. So, and what that does is if we're using our helpers later on, they're going to be reaching in here in order to get the proper access to the database. Basically, it's going to reach in here. This is going to tell it what environment it's in. So if we're in Postgres or SQL or MySQL or whatever database you decide to use, or something like that, this is going to tell it where that is. So let's say const next equals require connects. I keep saying next. It confuses the heck out of some people because there's already a Next.js floating around. So connects config equals require, and then we're going to basically tell it to go down to this next file, connects file. I'm gonna mess that up every single time. All right, so there we go. So now next thing we want to do is set up our environmental variable to tell us what node environment we're in. So that's going to be let env equal process dot env dot node, and you see how it auto populates down here. And I can't find it. There we go. Okay, and otherwise it should be in development. And then we're going to do a module dot exports equal connects, and that's going to basically create an instance of connects, and we're going to pass it this next config file, which is our next file, env. So we're going to pass it in this next config with this cool little env thing down here. And okay, all right, so that's taken care of. So now I want to create a new folder in this data thing. So now that we have in our data directory, now that we have our migration done and we know what a user looks like, I want to create a utility folder that helps us create a user. So we got that, and I also want to come down here and create our seed. So it's not going to be populated with anything yet. We're just going to make one the same way that we did with our migration that was still empty. So we're going to say connects and then seed and then make let's say 001 dash users. And there we go, and you saw down here that created a seed with users. So if we go down over here, right now we're not going to fill out anything except for this here. We're going to change these two little things here to users so that it knows what table we're talking about. And essentially down here, if you wanted to hard code your user, you could hard code the ID. You could go in here and give them the first name, last name, and all that. But if I were to tell you to generate 50 users, that would take you way too long. First off, after like the first 5 or so, you'll start running out of names and stuff that you want to put in there, and it's just gonna take a long time, and it's too much frustration. So I don't like doing that. So instead, what I'm gonna do is actually move our migrations over here so that we have a clear idea of what a user looks like. And then I want to dive into our utilities folder. So our utilities folder is going to help us generate a new user. So we're going to create a new file, and we're just going to call it index.js and move it over here so that we can keep a clear view of what our user looks like. And we're going to use those packages that we installed earlier. We're going to be using Faker to create fake data for us. We're going to be using bcrypt to encrypt our passwords for our fake users. And we're going to be using UUID to create a few unique identifications. Make sure that you're using /v4. All right, so our user takes in some roles. I personally don't like people just making up roles. I prefer that the backend has some pre-generated roles that it can go off of, and so we're just gonna make an array with just a few roles in it, and then we're gonna create a very quick function that'll randomly pick one of those and return them. So it's going to be const user role equals, and then we're gonna have a regular user, an admin, owner, and I guess we could have like a guest, just to have a good variety and stuff. And then we're going to have a function that's just going to be called pick one, and it's going to take in a item and then go into that item, do a little bit of computer science over here. Use math.floor and then math.random, and then we're going to multiply that with item times length. All right, so essentially if everything worked fine, if I wrote that correctly, then it should just take in we could call pick one, and then it'll take in user role, and then basically just return as a random item from there. We don't need it to go in order. We just wanted to do it randomly so that we can have a good distribution of roles amongst all the users. Okay, so now we get to the fun part. We get to generate a user. So we're going to define a user first with a function called generate users. And just by looking over here on the left side, we already know that a user takes in an ID. So we're defining that with UUID. We know that a user has a first name, so we're going to be using faker.name.firstName, and that's a function, or a method I should say. We're going to be defining their last name, so faker.name.lastName, and that's really just how easy Faker is to use. Forgot a comma over here. And then role. And then we're going to be using that pick one method that I talked about earlier, and we're going to pass it that user role, email, so faker.internet.email, and then password. This is the fun one where we get to use bcrypt, so we have bcrypt.hashsync, and then faker.lorem word. This is gonna just generate a word with like a certain amount of characters. It's like a random amount of characters, and then we're gonna hash it 10 times. So you can do this like less times if you want, like less security, or more times. The bigger number that you use, the more time it's gonna take. So keep that in mind. If you have something that's like 20 or 100, it might take a few minutes just to hash all the passwords. Okay, and so now we need to create a function that's going to iterate through all of this and generate as many users as we want. So we're going to use a little bit of recursion to do it, just because I find that it's the cleanest way to do it. If you want to do it iteratively, go for it. But we're going to define a function called accumulate, and it's going to take in a callback, which, if you don't know what a callback is, it's just a function that's being called over and over again. In this case, that's going to be our generate user. It's going to get called back over and over and over again. So because we want it to continue calling back, we're going to do it recursively, where we're going to call accumulate, and then it's going to be passing this in. It's going to be taking in this callback. So that means that as we're going in a circle, it's creating a new user over and over and over again. And in order for it to stop, we're going to pass in base case, which is going to be our iteration. So once this number is empty or whatever, then once it reaches down to 0, then we're no longer going to want to generate anything. So if, however, iteration is greater than 0, then we're going to want to return an array with the callback, and then we're going to also want to concat accumulate. So basically we're creating one array and then adding in accumulate in order to call it back again and continue going over and over again. And then we're going to be basically passing that callback in again, and we're going to be passing iteration, but this time we're going to be going at -1 because we want this iteration number to go down. And I'll show you what it looks like. I think it might make more sense once we actually call the function and pass in the actual arguments to it. But essentially for our else statement, we're just going to return an empty array, just because that means that we're pretty much done. Alright, so from there we're going to export all of this fun stuff that we did. As you can see, the only things that haven't been used is just these two functions, and so we're going to do a module.exports, and then we're just going to export it as an object called genUsers. And if you're wondering where this is coming from, we're treating it as an object, and so because of that, we're just giving it a random name. That's what they consider a foobar banana, I guess, where you can just give it whatever name you want. So we're going to call accumulate, and then we're going to call our generate users. So we're calling this function up here, and remember, this is going through the callback, so it's doing all of this stuff over again and then passing itself over and over and over again until it's completely done. And then we're going to generate 100 users. I'm a little greedy. I don't like to just do one thing. I like to do, like, I want a lot of people to be on my website, and so we're gonna have 100 of them. Okay, so now we have this cool little function over here made, and so what we're gonna do is we're gonna put that into our seed. So we need to import that in now. So we're going to say const genUsers equals require utils. Okay, and then instead of passing in all of this data that you would manually have to type in, I'm super lazy, and so I don't want to have to do all of that. We can just call genUsers. Alright, so we're calling genUsers. Now it has access to all of this data that we put into it based on our utils. So what we can do is come down over here and run that data. So we can say migrate latest, and what that does is that sets us up with the database based on the migration that we already filled out. So based on this, it's going to create one table in our database, and then next seeds, I think it's seeds, and then just say run. It should be seed. So connects seed run, and now it's running all of the stuff, and bcrypt is hashing a bunch of stuff, so it might take a little bit. And there we go. So now we have our users. So now we can check that we have our users. I'm going to be using what's called DB browser, which is this over here, and we can completely ignore all of this. Let's just open this file up, and then I can pretty much look into our server demo and then go into data. Here's our database. So now we can click on users over here, and it'll generate all of our users. So there's all of our users right there, and you see all their fake data. You have Noreen Torfy 50 at Gmail. So, and a few of them are Hotmail, some of them are Yahoo. If Yahoo's still around, I think it is. But it's creating all of this fake data, and then you have all of these unique identifications and stuff, which means that with how unique this is, it's gonna be a long time before we ever run into a duplicate number, if ever. So you don't need to worry about that at all. Okay, and then we also have our roles, which is going to be admin, guest, owner, user. So you see them kind of just going in very random order, random numbers, and the passwords are all hashed. So pretty damn good. And so the next thing that we want to do now is we can close out the database. We have our complete database already done. So now the next thing that we want to target is our API. We want to go back in here, and now that we have access to all of this cool stuff, we want to start on our helpers. So earlier we created those two files in here. We created our index and our user helper. Now we want to actually go through there and start filling that out. So first thing that we want to do is bring in our database, which is, if you remember earlier, it's going to be this config file that we created earlier. And that's going to give us access to the database based on what development or what environment we're in. All right, so we can get there by saying db or constdb, whatever name you want to call it. And that's going to go all the way back to database and then db config. And then we're also going to bring in UUID, because we're going to need it for new users that we generate. Version 4. All right, so first thing that we're going to do is create a get all users helper, and then I want to create a get single user, and then let's go down a little further. Okay, we're gonna have a add a user function, and then we're gonna have a update a user, and then last we're gonna have a delete a user. So four pretty common helpers that you're probably gonna see out in the wild a lot. So it should be very straightforward, especially once we start building like the first 2 or 3 or something. I think the rest of them will just make sense, because they're just going to be the same thing over and over again, or similar actions, I should say. So get all the users. Really all we need to do is just go into the database and call users, and that'll get all of the users. And then function get user, we're going to be passing in an ID, and then we're going to basically be digging into that user table or users table, and then we're going to do a match. So where, and then passes that as an object, user.id is equal to ID. So wherever it's equal to this, then we're going to want to return the first thing that it finds. And then we're going to add our user. So add user, it's going to take in a user object. So that's going to have all of the data, all of this stuff that is required, with a bare minimum of just role, first name, last name. And then there we go. So we need to drop that down one line. So now we need to define our new user, because we want to pass it that ID. So using that UUID, we don't want the user to have to generate his own ID or her own ID. we want to generate it, and then we want to pass in that user object. We're going to spread it in because otherwise you're going to have two separate arrays, and that's just disgusting. We don't do that. So going into users over here, and then from there we're just going to do a insert, and then we're going to insert that new user, and then basically our promise, we're just going to return res, and then just return res. So that should return us like an ID, I think, if I remember correctly. Alright, so, and then, like I said, a lot of it is just going to be very similar things. This one's just checking just returning everything. This one's returning the database, but then matching it, checking for the ID. This one's creating a new user based on what we're passing it in. And this user is just going to be a big object full of all of this stuff here. And then it's inserting it into the database and then returning back the ID. Alright, so update. So we're going to create function, update user, and this one's going to be a little different. It's going to take in an ID and an updates. And that updates is just going to be an object full of changes that the user is sending back to us. But we're just going to do very similar stuff to before. We're going to be returning user. So here's a cool thing if you don't know about it. If say you had a long name like organizations and you didn't want to keep writing it over and over again, you could just do you can do organizations as O, and so O will become a alias or whatever, or you can say as org. So in this case we could say users as U, and it's just to shorten it up a little bit. You don't even have to do that if you don't want to. Where u.id equals ID, and then now we want to pass in those updates. So we're gonna say update. So what it'll do is it's gonna match all of that stuff for us and get the that specific user based on the ID, and then pass in those updates and replace the old values that were in there. Alright, and then the last one that we have to make is the delete helper. So that's going to be function delete user, and then it's going to take in an ID, and we want to check if the ID is undefined just to have a little bit of validation on there. So undefined, and then we're basically going to return promise dot reject, and then say that this function delete user requires an ID. So the whole point of that is just because it's a lot easier to find anything that's broken, and you can probably do some more validation on these, but it's a lot easier to find if something is broken if we're telling it exactly where it's broken. So delete user is telling you, hey, come into this function and take a look. You're not passing an ID. Go look and see why we're not getting an ID. Okay, and then otherwise we're just going to return users as u dot where user, or let's say u dot id matches ID, and then we're just going to call the delete method. So that's it. That's all of our helper functions. Now we can just export it. So module dot exports, and it's just going to be an object, get users, get user, add user, update user, delete user. Alright, so very simple names. And then from there we'll just go into our index, and we're basically going to export we're going to export and import, if that makes sense. It'll probably won't until you see what I'm talking about. So module.exports, and I'm basically showing you guys a bunch of different ways that you can do cool things with module.exports. just because when I was learning this, like nobody told me that. They're just like, just do it and shut up and move on with your life. And so it took me a little bit of understanding. But we're gonna create an object, and our object's gonna be called users, and then require user helper. If I could spell right, there we go. So what we're doing here is we're creating an object with a key called users, and then what it's returning is everything inside of this file. So we're saying you're gonna be importing everything from this file here through an export. So as weird as it looks, it works. I promise you it does. So just believe me, it works. All right. Okay, so we have our middleware, we have our helpers. So the last thing that we need to do is build out our routes. We don't have one in there yet, and so it's kind of lonely. So we're going to do the same thing with this one that we did with our helper. We're going to create a index.js, and index.js is really just going to be exporting all the routes because like I said before, if you build modular, you can have your routes for your user organizations, any other tables that you create, any other schemas or whatever that you create, you can have them in their own files and then just import them into our index and basically just do like you did with the helper here, where you're just passing them into little objects. So if we had a whole bunch of helpers, we can just keep passing them in there instead of having these ginormous files. Okay, so with index, we're going to leave that alone for now, but we are going to be making a user route. Alright, so with our user route, we're going to be taking advantage of something new called router. So first we need to bring in Express, and we're not going to be creating a new instance of Express just because you don't want a bunch of different servers floating around. So instead of that, we're going to be using part of Express, which lets you use something called router. So express.router, and all router is just saying that we're going to be using Express, but it's not going to be defined here. It's going to be defined somewhere else, and we're just going to be passing it along, and hopefully you'll define it later. So hopefully that makes sense. And then we're also going to be bringing in bcrypt because we're going to want to hash the passwords of new users that are being created. So, and then don't forget bcrypt.js. Okay. And then we're going to want to bring in those helpers. So const, and then get users, get user, add users, update user, delete user, equals require helpers, and then user helper. Alright, so the first route that we're going to create is going to be our get route. So we're going to be actually using it with router.get. Now if you remember before in our server we're using server.get, but this time we're going to be using router.get just because we're not going to be making a new Express instance. We already have an instance, so we're using router so that we can basically pass it down in here, and it'll pretty much take over for router and take everything that's in it and define it as a server, if that makes sense. I hope it does. Alright, so recres, and then we're going to be using our get users. So for this one, get all users. So that's our function that we made, our helper function. So get users, and then that's going to return a promise. And then we're going to pass in, it's going to return a promise with our users, and we're going to basically return it back to the front end. We're going to tell them that if they got this far, they're getting a res.json or a res.status of 200, and then we're sending back the users as a JSON object. If there's an issue with the server, generally I like to give a lot more detail than what I'm going to be giving here, but because this is already going to be going long enough, I'll just cover what it's for. So when you get down to this point where the catches an error, it's usually something that might be with the database. Like if you're using Postgres and it's missing some code or something, this catch block is going to catch it and send it to you. So it's going to be a lot of things that's behind the scenes that might not necessarily have to do so much with the code that's up here. So it's good to have as much details down here as possible. In most cases, you can get away with something like just writing a message saying your server done broke, and then passing in the error over here. So that'll pass in your server done broke, and so you'll know that error message came from here, and then it'll pass in the actual error that it caught. So basically, it'll help you debug your own code later if it ever gets down to that. All right, so next one is going to be get a user. So that's going to be router.get, and then /. This one's going to take in an ID parameter. So rec and then res. Just so you remember, that is request and response. Request comes from the front end, response gets sent to the back end. So that's why you're seeing res over here. But we are going to use rec on this one. So, and that's because we're expecting the front end to send us an ID. So that's going to come in from rec.params. So basically, the request parameter is this ID that's going to be populated here. And then we get to use our fun get user function. We get to pass in that ID in there, and then it's going to return a promise of that user. And so we can say if not user, so if there is no user, then we can give the error message of res.status 400.json, and then we can just say message, and then generally you wouldn't do this, but I want to do this just so that we can validate later on that the ID that we're passing in doesn't exist. So we can say that user ID, and then say ID doesn't exist. So I don't recommend you sending an ID as a message or anything like that, just because I think that it's really bad practice to expose the user's ID anywhere or any of the user's data. But just for the purpose of this, we're going to do that. All right, else everything is all good, so we can send the front end status of 200 and let them know that, hey, here's your user. And then again, we can put in this catch. I'm just going to copy it. It's going to be the same like almost every time, so I'm just going to copy and paste that. Okay, so there we go. So the next thing that we need to do is our post method. And this is pretty much just going to be for registering a user. And a lot of times people like to do a post and then do / register. I'm super lazy, so I'm just going to leave it / I don't care. If I was creating a bigger API than this, then I think I would take that into consideration. But I probably would also separate the registration and all that into an auth file. All right, so this post is going to take in a rec.body. So it's going to take in credentials. So basically username, password, all that stuff, like all this fun stuff that we say is required. It's going to take all of that in. And so we're going to call that creds for credentials, and then rec.body, and then we're gonna hash the password that they send. So assuming that rec.body is coming in with a password, we can pretty much say hash equals bcrypt dot hash sync, and then take in creds dot password, and we can hash it like I'll say 10 times. You can go 14, 20, 30, doesn't matter. Just know that the bigger the number that you put in there, the longer it's going to take. Okay, so now we have our password hashed. So we can say creds dot password equals hash. So basically what we're doing is we have a reference to rec.body, so what's getting passed in by the front end or by Postman, and then we have our hashed password over here. So our password is just going to be bcrypt hash, and then it's going to have a method that takes in the password and the how many times we want to hash it, and then it's defining the password as this hash. So it's like if you have an object and that object has let's say password equals hello, and then you come in here and say let's say creds dot password. Now it's gonna equal whatever the heck bcrypt sends back, which is something that looks like this. So that's basically what that is. All right. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, we get to use our fun little helper function again. So we get to do add user, and then send back the credentials, which is going to have the rec.body, and then that's going to send in a promise back, and then which is going to be an ID, and then do a res.status 201. 201 means that something was created in the database, and then we can send in that ID. And then same as before, we can just say your server done broke or something and drop that in there. And there we go. And so well, it looks like I accidentally deleted that last line. So creds.password equals hash. Alright. I don't know why I deleted that. Okay. So now we also want to be able to update a user. So we can say router dot put, and I completely forgot to put my little comment in here. So register a user or add a user, and then update a user. And let's scroll down here. So router dot put, and then again you can totally make like a API / edit or something like that. I wouldn't even add the API because we're going to be defining the actual prefix to the route later on once we finish all of this. So you can just put whatever you would want later on. So it would be like edit and then ID or something like that. For this case, we're just going to go to ID. And that's only because we only have like so many unique methods. Like this is the only time that we're using post. This is the only time we're using put, and then we're only going to use delete one time. So if you have multiple of those, then it might be a good idea for you to use more unique addresses. Alright, so we're going to be using rec and res again, and then we're just going to get a reference to that ID just like we did before. And then that's going to come in from rec.params. And then we're going to take in an update, and that's going to be coming in from rec.body. So we have to assume that rec.body is going to be a object that has some of this data at least to be changed. And then we can use our helper. So update user ID. We're going to pass in that ID as the first parameter of update helper. And if we hover over it, we can see right over here that it takes in an ID of any and an updates. So that pretty much tells us what it needs. So update takes in ID and then updates. There we go. Takes in ID and updates, and that's going to return us a promise. Then user, and you can use try catch and async and await and all that stuff with this if you want to. I'm just doing it this way just because it's just faster for me. And then .status 200.json, and then that's going to be taking in that user. And then same thing as before, we're just going to be dropping in this catch. All right. So the last thing that we need to do now is delete a user. Alright, so we're going to start off just like before, delete, and you'll notice that we're writing a lot of the same things over and over again. There's really not much difference in a lot of this until you start like joining tables and dealing with bigger relationships. Until then a lot of this is going to basically become muscle memory and just sink in, and you're just going to know that this is what you have to do. So again, we're getting the ID from rec.params. And then using that helper delete user method that we created earlier, we're passing in the ID, and then that's going to return a promise, and we're going to shove the ID or the user in there, and then res.status 200 just to let them know that it's okay. We're not really returning anything, but we're letting them know that there was no errors that happened. And then we can just paste in our catch block again. And that's pretty much it. After that, we just export module.exports our router, come into this cool little index file that we created, and then const user router equals require, and this is just another way that that we can do it just like how we did it earlier, except this time I'm requiring user router up here instead of doing it in the module.exports. So module.exports equals user router. So different way of doing it from what we did over here, where we defined an object and then told it that its value is going to be this import. Instead over here, I'm defining it up here as user router and then bringing it down here. So they're the same thing, just different ways of doing it. All right, so we completed this and this. So now we just need to bring in our server, pretty much all of our server stuff that we got from there. So we can do that up here. We can bring in our route by saying const user router equals require routes. And that's all we have to say, just because we called our file index, and so it knows what indexes. That's the first thing that it's going to look for. So we don't have to specifically say index.js. Okay, so now we imported that in, and now we can also define it down here by saying server.use, and then define our prefix for that address, and then user router. So basically what this is doing is saying that, if you remember over here, everything over here is just /. So this cool little prefix here lets us type in users and then a / and then ID or nothing at all, and now it knows what it is. Alright, so I typed in a lot of code, and I don't recommend ever doing this. I just like to live on the wild side sometimes, but I typed in a lot of code and never ran the database, or not the database, but the server, so I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm hoping that it works. Otherwise, you're going to see me debugging for like a really long time. But let me just bring up this here, and let's see, ls, we got a cd on back to our main root directory. Alright, so we got cd one more time, and that should get us there. Yep. So now we can do yarn server, and hopefully nothing crashes. Oh, something crashed. So user router, let's find out what this is. Okay, so something in user router isn't happy, and it looks like it's in line 20, or maybe it's my helper. Let's see, cannot find user router. Why can you not find user router? Did I type in the wrong address for some reason? Is it this here? User router. Oh, I think this is it right here. Yeah. User routes. Okay. Let's see. Alright, so I have another error now. Seems that add user is not defined. So user helper, let's see. User helper, so add user. Oh, I forgot to use a capital letter there. Okay, add user. Okay, so now we're running. Sorry about that. So, so now we're running over here, and honestly, for writing this much code without running it at all, that's not too bad, if I do say so myself. But let's see, starting node index.js, and then API running on port 9000. So that means we need to go into port 9000, and we're gonna do that with. You can do this on the browser or whatever if you want, but I find that Postman or Insomnia or any other helpful applications like that will work. So we're gonna run this again to make sure that everything's running. And if you look over here, I want to actually let's see if I can shrink this a little bit. Alright, so let's just keep an eye on this over here. You see this little thing down here, so every time I press it, and that's Morgan right there. That's what Morgan is doing for us. And like I said, you can use different configurations that'll get you way more details than that. In this case, all it's doing is telling me what HTTP method I used, what status it returned, how much time, and all of this other stuff. But you can also get that from up here in Postman, so you don't even need that. Okay. So the first cool thing that we want to do is let's delete this. Let's delete that there and try to see if we can get all the users. So there we go. These are all of our users, all 50 of them. Notice that it did not take me half the time to make all of these users, just because I had that utilities helper function, which I can go back and edit. And if I do create more tables, then I can just easily just keep making more and more of those generate functions that will make them and just pass them through that accumulator function. So very easy to edit. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to register a user. So let's see. I'm gonna register this person here that I already have pre-generated, and we're gonna send that out. And we got a cool little SQL error, so let's find out what that error is. Your server done broke. So my server done broke. Okay, let's see, why did it break? Let's see, first name, last name, role, password. You know what, chances are, knowing me and how I write code, it probably did generate. Nope. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so something legitimately broke. Cool. So we can take a look at it. Okay, so We go back into our server here, and actually not even the server. Let's take a look at our helper. Let's see, user helper. So add a user. Okay, so new user ID, UUID, and we're passing in the user. Ah, here it is. It's because I missed an S. Those damn typos. Okay, so now we should be able to do it. All right, so we're gonna send that in, and there we go. So we get the ID number or whatever that is, and we can double check that that person was sent in. Send it to all. Nope, wrong one. We don't even need this one open anymore, so we can close that. But we can send that, and then down here is my new user. All right, we can edit that user. So let's get that user's ID. And mind you, anytime that you create a table like this and all that and you're done with everything, you should test it. You should definitely test it and then write test that'll tell everybody else that your stuff is right. So what did I forget here? All right, so far I've broken 2 routes. But essentially I really just discovered that 2 routes were broken. Users as you. Let's see. Oh, wait. Before I do any of that crazy stuff, make sure, let's see. Let's make sure that I'm grabbing the right stuff. So this person here with the ID. And then this right here. Okay. Update is not defined. All right, so we got to make sure that we're always reading the error messages. So update user. So it's telling me that update for some odd reason is not defined. Oh, again, I missed an S. Okay, so now we send it. There we go. So we got 1. So if we run this again, notice that every time that we do this, we have to get a new HTTP request. All right, so yep, that name changed. And then now we can come in and delete this user, assuming I did not forget an S somewhere else. And there we go. So we got a 1 back. And that user should no longer be there. So yep, that user is now gone. So there we go. We just built a very basic but very effective Node server application with full CRUD for a user. And it looks like a lot, but once we break it down to this, we only have like 2 files, like 2 directories. And then each one of them is split up into small directories, which lets you work in teams a lot better. So essentially what I really wanted to cover more so, like more than anything else, is the file structure. As you can see, it's just a lot cleaner, and seems that anybody can just come in here and start creating new files or working on other files, and it just keeps it a lot more organized so that other teams and other teammates can just hop in and be able to get into this code base. And as it grows bigger and bigger, I think it'll maintain scale to an appropriate level. So if you managed to stay on that long, I hope that I did teach you something. And if I did, then feel free to like the video, comment, and subscribe. If there's anything that I could do to improve, maybe you would like to see shorter videos or anything like that, just let me know and put that in the comments below. And other than that, thank you so much for your time and have a great day. God, I swear one of these days I'm going to remember how to turn this thing off. I have no idea. There has to be a hotkey or something.